It is January 1945 in the frozen ice-cracked yard of a ruined stone cottage outside Bastogne. 42-year-old Marie Dubois steps through a doorway blown off its hinges, holding a dented tin container of chicory coffee in her chapped, raw hands. She walks right past the idling engine of an armored jeep, and stops inches from the broad-shouldered giant in the high-collared trench coat with the polished ivory revolvers. Without speaking a word of English, she pours a dark, steaming liquid into a chipped ceramic mug and extends it toward General George S. Patton. The surrounding military escort freezes instantly. Corporal Jim Baker of the 101st Airborne grips his M1 rifle tight against his winter coat, his eyes darting frantically between the unknown local woman, the unvetted cup, and the three-star general who commands the entire Third Army. Staff officers stand completely motionless in the knee-deep sub-zero snow, their breath catching in the bitter air, every man silently calculating the catastrophic mistake of allowing a civilian to approach the war's most volatile commander without clearance. Patton looks down at the steaming mug, then into the weathered, grief-lined eyes of the Belgian mother. He does not reach for his sidearm, he does not shout for his security detail to clear the yard. The silence in the courtyard stretches taut and fragile against the distant rumble of artillery. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reveal a side of the commander that no battle plan ever captured, and the answer was not what anyone in that frozen yard was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button right now, joining our growing community to discover the quiet, forgotten human moments that truly define the battlefield. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it cost Marie Dubois to step into that frozen yard carrying a tin container of chicory coffee, you have to understand what the Ardennes had become in January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its final, most punitive weeks. Around Bastogne, the winter was not just weather. It was an active enemy. Sub-zero temperatures locked the forest floor into concrete, turning shattered pine needles and frozen mud into sharp edges. Village after village had been pulverized by relentless artillery fire, reduced to jagged stone chimneys poking out of snowdrifts. For the civilians caught in the middle, daily life had collapsed into primitive survival. There was no coal, no electricity, and no food beyond what could be hidden beneath floorboards or dug from freezing cellars. Coffee made from real beans was a long-forgotten memory, replaced by bitter chicory root scraped from dried stalks and boiled over open fires. To own even a small tin container of chicory was to possess a week of warmth, a single calculated comfort in a world defined by absolute deprivation. Then there were the military realities of approaching a three-star Army commander in an active combat zone. In January 1945, security along the front line was at a fever pitch. German infiltrators dressed in American uniforms had spent weeks sabotaging crossroads and ambushing staff vehicles. Every soldier in the field was instructed to treat every civilian with deep suspicion and every unexpected approach as a potential threat. An unknown Belgian woman walking directly toward General Patton with an uninspected container of hot liquid broke every standing protocol of force protection. The guards escorting the command vehicle were trained to intervene instantly, physically blocking or detaining anyone who compromised the perimeter. Stepping across that snowbound courtyard was not merely a polite gesture. It was an act that put her life directly between nervous trigger fingers and a commander whose fierce reputation preceded him everywhere he went. On the grand scale of the war, Patton was managing an immense machinery of men, fuel, and heavy tonnage. His Third Army was consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline each day, measuring progress in miles gained and enemy divisions broken. In that brutal operational calculus, a single cup of brewed chicory possessed zero military value. It could not fill a tank, fire an artillery shell, or advance a front line. Yet, in the human arithmetic of winter warfare, that tiny offering represented 100% of what Marie Dubois had left to give. It was a transaction of total scarcity against overwhelming military power. And that was the yard Marie Dubois stepped into. Picture the scene. It is 19 degrees in that ruined farmyard outside Bastogne. Half a dozen staff officers stand rigidly in knee-deep drifts, their heavy wool coat collars pulled high against a razor-sharp wind. Beside them, an armored command jeep sits idling, its exhaust forming thick gray plumes in the freezing air. The light is fading fast into a slate-gray twilight. Marie Dubois stands motionless in the snow, her breath rising in ragged wisps, holding out that chipped ceramic mug poured from her dented tin container of chicory coffee. Steam drifts between them, carrying the dark earthy aroma of scorched roots into the bitter frost. Corporal Jim Baker watches from 5 yards away, his numb fingers locked tight against the icy receiver of his M1 rifle. The entire escort detail is frozen in a collective, breathless calculation. Every man in that yard knows the legendary volatility of General George S. Patton. They know his explosive temper, his unyielding demand for total military discipline, and the terrifying speed with which his fury could descend upon anyone who breached protocol. They had all heard the stories of his ruthless demands for absolute control. The staff officers braced themselves for the inevitable outbreak, fully expecting him to brush the cup aside or bark an order to clear the yard. Stay with me, because what happened next in that snowbound courtyard is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive are consistent in shape. They do not record a grand speech, a dramatic gesture, or a polished military performance in that snowbound courtyard. They record a quiet, deliberate sequence of physical movements executed in near total silence. Patton looked down at the chipped mug in the woman's hands, then back into her weathered eyes, not the way a general looks at an unforeseen security risk, not the way a commander looks at an unwanted civilian delay. He looked at Marie Dubois the way an exhausted soldier looks at a sudden unmerited grace. Without speaking, he reached out his gloved hands, took the warm mug, and drank every drop of the dark, bitter liquid. He handed the empty mug back to her, turned toward his orderly sitting in the idling jeep, and spoke just 2 words: "Bring it." The orderly scrambled into the rear of the jeep and emerged carrying a heavy canvas bag and 2 wooden supply crates. Patton took the 5-pound sack of quartermaster sugar, placed it directly into Marie's arms alongside the rations, and held her gaze for 3 long seconds. The courtyard remained entirely motionless. Corporal Jim Baker watched from 5 yards away, his numb fingers still locked around the receiver of his M1 rifle, trying to process the scene unfolding before him. There was no press photographer from Stars and Stripes to document the gesture, and no speeches were made about the liberation of Western Europe. Corporal Baker later described the entire exchange with a single word: quiet. Patton simply turned on his heel, climbed back into the passenger seat of his open jeep, pulled his high collar tight against the freezing wind, and signaled the driver to pull back onto the ice-rutted road toward the front line. See, what most folks don't realize is that Patton was a commander obsessed with operational logistics, a man who measured victory in miles gained, fuel consumed, and supply tonnage delivered. In standard Army accounting, 5 pounds of refined quartermaster sugar and 2 full crates of field rations were vital combat assets. They belonged to front-line infantrymen fighting in sub-zero foxholes outside Bastogne, men who needed every calorie to survive the brutal night. Handing those provisions to an unknown civilian breached every standard supply protocol in the Third Army. But Patton understood an arithmetic that extended far beyond quartermaster ledgers and supply manifests. He recognized that the dented tin container of chicory coffee represented absolute abundance to a woman who had nothing left to lose. Her offering was not a surplus item. It was 100% of her remaining world. To accept that sacrifice without offering something of real value in return was a moral deficit he refused to carry. By exchanging high-priority Army provisions for boiled root water, Patton was not being sentimental, he was balancing a human equation. He recognized that preserving dignity in a frozen wasteland was just as essential to the war effort as gasoline, artillery shells, or armored divisions. Every officer who served under General George S. Patton, Jr. during the European campaign understood that the Third Army operated at a tempo unmatched by any other command. Decisions that would take days in rear echelon headquarters were executed in minutes along the forward line, driven by Patton's belief that speed, audacity, and relentless pressure were the ultimate life-saving tools on a battlefield. Yet this relentless drive was balanced by an unyielding respect for practical competence on the ground, proving time and again that a commander who listens to physical ground truth is a commander who achieves decisive victory. Marie Dubois was 42 years old, born and raised in the stone village of Noville, 6 kilometers north of Bastogne. Her father, Luc, had been a local stonemason who spent 40 years squaring granite blocks for farmhouses across the Ardennes. He taught his daughter that a structure was not held together by grand speeches, but by precise, honest effort, brick by brick, against the winter wind. Before the war swept through the Ardennes, Marie kept a quiet home, tending a small vegetable plot and sewing working coats for neighboring families. She knew the exact yield of every row of potatoes and the precise shelf life of preserved lard. When her husband was taken for forced labor in 1942, the burden of survival fell entirely on her shoulders. For 3 weeks during the siege of Bastogne, she had kept her 3 children, 12-year-old Jean, 10-year-old Claire, and 7-year-old Henri, hidden in the dark root cellar beneath the floorboards, while heavy artillery flattened the village above them. She had no grand plans for after the war beyond rebuilding her roof and seeing her children grow up in a quiet valley. She was not a romantic, she was not a martyr. She was the kind of woman who looked at absolute ruin and focused entirely on the one practical thing she could fix. When Marie carried the 5-pound sack of sugar and the heavy ration crates back inside her damaged cottage, her reaction was remarkably practical. She did not marvel at the 3 silver stars painted on the jeep, nor did she speak of the famous commander who had just stood in her yard. She simply placed the canvas sack on her scrubbed kitchen table, right beside her dented tin container of chicory coffee. She opened a tin of meat, divided it into 3 equal portions for her hungry children, and carefully stowed the sugar inside a dry stone hollow behind the hearth. When a neighbor later asked her about the American general in the polished leather coat, Marie offered only a flat, matter-of-fact summary. She said he was a man who looked terribly tired, and who drank hot liquid without saying a word. Corporal Jim Baker, 21, from Muncie, Indiana, attached to the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne, survived the brutal winter campaign in the Ardennes and the subsequent advance into the German heartland. He returned home to Indiana in November 1945, took a job as a machinist at an automotive transmission plant, and married his high school sweetheart, Helen. For 50 years, Baker rarely spoke about the shelling, the frostbite, or the casualties his squad suffered in the snowy woods. But every winter, when the first snowfall covered his quiet Midwestern neighborhood, he would recall that frozen yard outside Bastogne. He remembered the total silence of the staff officers, and the image of the Third Army commander handing high-priority military supplies to a Belgian mother. Baker lived a quiet, full life until his passing in 1998, leaving behind a short, hand-written memoir that captured the encounter not as a myth of war, but as a moment of simple human clarity. Was Patton right to hand over vital military provisions to an unknown civilian in the middle of an active, high-stakes winter campaign? Some would say that diverting high-energy rations and scarce quartermaster sugar from infantrymen fighting in frozen foxholes breached fundamental supply discipline in a brutal war governed by strict logistics. Giving away vital combat assets to an unvetted local set a reckless precedent and compromised the immediate operational readiness of his men. Others would say exactly the opposite, that military authority without moral clarity is nothing more than brute force. By choosing to honor a mother's quiet sacrifice with genuine generosity, Patton preserved the fundamental human dignity that the war was ultimately fought to protect, proving that even in the darkest winter mercy has its own vital place on the battlefield. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.